I had to just, as I think everybody does, and I'm probably thinking about it right now a lot, but I had a wonderful mother who was not only mother, but she was mother and dad so much of the time. Now, when I was younger, uh, I had a great relationship with my dad. He played ball with me and did different things, and used to go down and meet him late on Saturday night after his work at the barber shop was over, and we'd walk home together. And I remember he and Mom were neither one 30 years old yet, but some of my friends told about their dad being drinking a lot and causing trouble, and I was just, in my own heart, I was so proud that my dad was not a drinker. But not long after that, he bought a little barber shop and was right connected with the pool hall and where there was liquor available. I don't know if that was it or if he had some friends there in town. But he did start drinking, and he started being irresponsible. And it wasn't long till he just kind of took off. I don't think he thought about it as deserting the family, but he just went off on his own. And he would cut hair at this town and then move on to another place, and very seldom sent any money home. And if he got back on Christmas, it'd be late in the day, and he would be drinking and bring us some little something or other that was very disappointing. And Mom would make us wait till he got home before we could open our presents. So that made Christmas a little bit not as fun as it should have been. But, and so, he was a very little part in my life from probably the time I was 13. And we had to, I guess they lost the house where we'd been living over in one section of town, and we moved over and lived with her mom and dad. Had moved in off the farm. Now, when I was quite small, I used to visit them on the farm and had some experience with farm life and so on, but they were in town by this time, and so we lived there, and Bob's been there, and our kids have been there because my grandparents lived there at least till Graham died, which was in 1955. In 1940, 13 years, that would have been 1940 when we moved over there. And my brother, 6 years younger than me, he remembers pulling the red wagon with stuff from our house in Kenwood over to the other house. I do not remember that day, and I might have been working somewhere or something, I'm not sure. But I do know we moved over there, and we lived in this house, which belonged to the Catholic Church next door, and rented it from them, my grandparents did. And Bob he wasn't too old last time we were there. I can't remember how many rooms, but there was at least probably 7 or 8 people living there because my great-grandmother lived with us, and sometimes my grandma would take in elderly ladies that didn't have anywhere to live. And but I never felt crowded or mistreated. I mean, it was a happy family, that way. But one thing about my mom, and of course when Dad was out on his own, Mom had to find work to support us, and she waited tables and cleaned restaurants and did all kind of janitor work and cleaned houses, and I don't remember what all. And I remember helping her one of the restaurants in town that we would go on Saturday night. I was probably about 13 or 14, and we'd clean it up for the week. Helen's Cafe, right across from the post office. Anyhow, as time went by, Mom went to the draft board and got my dad drafted. He was a little bit on the upper level of age, but they found a place for him as an MP with POWs that by that time were coming back from Europe and had camps in the South, a lot of them. So he was able to handle that, and she started getting the allotment check from military service. And so he was in the Army maybe for a year or so. And when he came home, he wanted to see if they could make a new start. He was very contrite and apologetic for the way he'd been doing. And so they did. But Mom said, we're not going to start over here in town. We need to move somewhere where people don't know us that well and make a new start. And so they moved to Southern Oregon, Medford, Oregon. Well, I had about a half a year of school left. That year was my sophomore year. So I stayed in Chadron and finished my high school year out and stayed with my grandparents. And one thing about my mom, she trusted me to act like an adult. And when I was 14 years old, she let me hitchhike 150 miles from home, get a job on a construction job with Army ordnance plant where they're building a hospital. I wound up being on the ditch digging crew, and I could have toughed it out. I was living in a barracks. It was like the Army almost. We had a mess hall and lived with the guys in the barracks, and I was 14. I don't know how old they were, quite a bit older, some of them. But I was big enough they didn't question me too much about my age. But I heard about a job up north, up in Rapid City, South Dakota, at the air base that was paying, I was getting 65 cents an hour. And my first job paid 75 cents a day for 10 hours, so this was a pretty good boost. And in between time, the next year I did cut grass and I helped my granddad. He had an old trailer in the back of his 28 Dodge, and he had farmer friends, and they would let us come out and dig up the barnyard manure, fertilizer, and load up the trailer and haul it in and spread it out on people's lawns. You know, that was good fertilizer for the arms yard. So that was my main job when I was 13, because I started a truck farm at 12. But Mom always, if I thought I could do something, and in fact, the day I went that 150 miles, there was about 5 of us that was supposed to go because we talked it up among ourselves. That Saturday morning when it was time to get out on the highway, nobody showed up, and they told me later their moms wouldn't let them go. So anyhow, that's the kind of mother she was, just trusting. And in my poem, if you heard me say, I grew up fast in Nebraska land, and just because she was that way, and she let me do things, let me work, and so I think it did help me grow up to be more adult than I was for my age. Anyhow, that's what my lovely bride-to-be said when people asked her why she was dating this young kid, and she said, well, he's mature for his age, and so on. So that worked out okay. And I think back about my growing up and the way Maxine grew up on the farm. She learned to work, pick cotton and other things on the farm, and we both were low maintenance. We weren't used to having a lot of extra money. We just enjoyed the necessities of life, and so that carried over into our marriage because we were pretty low income, for quite a few years, but we always had enough, and there was never a disagreement about money, and no problem with, I thought she had grown up as a tither, but she said in her testimony she'd never heard of it before. But I started tithing when I was baptized at age 12. When I was making $10 a week, I paid my gram $5 board and room, and I gave $2 to church for tithing offering. So I was used to that and part of my lifestyle, and she was all for it. So anyhow, later on, things with my dad took a good turn. Now, out in Oregon, I lived with him for half a school year, And then I came back to my hometown and finished out my junior and senior year. And I had a job back there, back home, so they gave me my job back. And when I first got to Oregon, Dad was not drinking at all. But by the time I left, and I didn't leave because he was drinking, but I could tell that every once in a while he came home, you know, a little bit intoxicated, and I never heard him be angry or strike my mom or anything like that, but he just became irresponsible. In fact, one of the early years back in Chadron, he showed up one time. He had been gone several weeks, and he said, the other night I woke up and I was in Chicago. He said, I don't even know how I got there. And that's a long ways away from my hometown in northwest Nebraska. But anyhow, after I moved back home, our family moved out to by that time I had still a brother and a little sister. They moved out to a smaller town, and as long as the war was going, Dad had a good, almost a managerial type job in the fruit orchard business or the fruit packing. But when the GIs, you know, the draftees got out, well, they gave them their jobs back. So Bruce told me a lot of this on the phone recent years, that Dad couldn't hardly find work. He was middle-aged and up, and said he tried doing all kind of things, and most of it didn't work out. Mom was working for a man that grew bulbs to ship overseas, and she also was a postmistress in that little town. So she kept working, and Bruce said they bought an old chicken coop and rebuilt it into a little house where they lived. So, you know, Dad was pretty good with his hands. He loved gardening and things like that. So he said things went pretty well for a while until Dad couldn't find work. And I think, well, he said the last time we saw him, at that time he took the family car and took off, and we didn't hear from him. So Mom decided they better move back home to where her folks lived. And as it happened, Maxine and I married on November 1st, 47. She finished her school year, and I was in college. And when the summer break came, I took her home. We went home by Greyhound bus to visit my family and get acquainted with her, because they had had some misgivings, you know, me being way off in Alabama. And she had to sign my letter giving me permission to get married. But as soon as they met Maxine, I mean, she was right in there doing all the housework with Mom, and she was just her own old self, you know. I mean, she was just her. And they learned right off that I was a pretty smart guy. I mean, thank the Lord, I didn't get credit for it really. But anyhow, on that trip, now we went by Greyhound and got to a town about 60 miles away, and we had to transfer to a small local bus to get on home to Chadron. And so we had gotten off that bus and probably had a meal there and waiting around, and when the bus that Mom and my brother and sister were on arrived, and they were there a little while, but we hadn't seen each other until we started to get on the bus to get home. And Mom had these two kids, and she had the luggage. Bruce was helping some, but it seemed like one of the suitcases fell open and out there on the concrete. Well, Maxine and I were sitting toward the back, but I went out to try to help her. I did not even recognize her at first. I just saw this lady having a problem. Well, when we met out there, it was, looky here, who's here? Mom was there and I was there, and we hadn't seen each other, you know, since graduation. But anyhow, we went on to back home and had a nice visit, and she and sister and brother stayed there for the rest of the time, and she made another real good marriage, which I was thankful for. But my dad, he also made a good marriage. He was still traveling around, and he liked stamps and coins, and he had become the editor of a coin club newspaper. My grandmother always said he was one of the smartest men that she ever knew. So he did have a lot of smarts. Just had a high school education, but he didn't seem to know how to do things. Anyhow, he met this single lady down in Colorado at one of his club meetings, and they hit it off, an older lady. But she had been the working woman. She lived with her mother and her sister, who were both, her mother was a widow, her sister was single, so Grandma Gay worked at a bank, and so she brought the money, you know, she earned a living for them, and Mom and sisters kept the house. And
Grandma Vera.
Grandma Vera, what did I say?
You say Grandma Gay.
Okay, I got several grandmas like that. Okay, Grandma Vera, yeah. So we met her for the first time down in Hastings, Nebraska, on the way back to Alabama from my grandmother Fleming's funeral, the grandmother that helped raise me. We were living in Pineapple at that time, just been out of seminary a short time, and she passed away. So we drove up for the funeral, got there, had to drive through a snowstorm the last 60 miles. We got there just barely in time for the funeral, and they had to keep punching me to keep me awake because we'd been driving all night, day and night. Anyhow, on the way back, we knew Dad was married and living in Hastings, and that was pretty much right on the way. That was the Saturday before Easter. We got to their house right after lunch, I guess, and got to meet Grandma Vera, and she was so happy to meet us, and seemed like she thought a lot of us, you know, as we got to know each other better. But she was very active in the Methodist Church, and she was mission-minded, and she just seemed to be thrilled to have a preacher, son and daughter, you know, and later when we were missionaries too. But anyhow, the interesting thing that day, we sat around and we visited, had a good visit, and Bev and Ruth were still pretty young. They were getting a little restless. And it was getting on toward supper time, maybe past a little bit, and we found out later that Grandma Vera never had cooked a meal in her life because that wasn't her part in the family, you know. But so your mom, later, was your mom, you know, she said, well, Vera said, could I help you in the kitchen anyway? Yes, you could, Max. She breathed a sigh of relief, and they went to the kitchen, and Mom pretty well cooked it, you know, and Vera helped her. And I mean, I think that lady was sitting there all afternoon. What are we going to do about supper? Now, she obviously maybe had cooked a little for Dad, or if they'd been eating out, I don't know, because they hadn't been married very long. But anyhow, she learned to cook a little bit. Now, she always had a job when they moved to South Dakota. And I felt sorry for her because some of the ladies in town, that little town, were ranch ladies, and they could cook up a breeze. And she, you know, they kind of made fun of her once in a while. I thought was very rude, but not too bad. Well, anyhow, before Dad married Vera, he had finally realized he needed help. He got into Alcoholics Anonymous and quit drinking, and I'm pretty sure he gave his heart to the Lord. Just the way he talked, I think he did. We didn't have a lot of time with him after that, but he did quit, and I know when they moved to South Dakota, he was very much always on, on call. If any guys were being tempted or starting to drink, if they would call him, he'd go spend any time with them to help them stop, you know, and get straightened out. And then later on, I might have heard him say a little bit about this, but as he was getting older, somehow, as I said, he was a smart fellow, and he figured out some of the how to cut through the red tape for the veterans, you know, that needed their benefits. And these were practically all Indian Americans. But I found out later that he had been helping a lot of them. This was after he died, and we stopped there to visit. And an Indian man told me that my dad had helped him a great deal, and all the other Indian fellows. So he really proved himself. Unfortunately, he passed away there, but was buried right by the river. So he wound up in a good place. Well, I want to say one or two more things about my mom. She was, I think, she never had any high position or any. She did get a job as a telephone operator, which was the best job she ever had as far as finances go, and it was right behind our house there in Shadwin. So that time of her life, she worked there and had a decent pension and all of that. But she was always active in church, not as a, she wasn't up front very much, but if there was a supper to be served or some help some family. In fact, George, her second husband, who was a great guy too, I won't spend a lot of time on him, but one Christmas, now Mom also worked with a little lady that was a home missionary to the Indians, and she had a little chapel, a place there in town, and Mom would take food down there, and because I don't know if this lady had food to eat all the time, but she helped her a lot with that, and providing supplies for the chapel and practical stuff. My mom was like a Martha. Now I think she had her merry moments too, her and the Lord, and I got the impression, because when I left that job at digging ditches and went up to South Dakota, which my job there lasted 1 week, and I had to come home and get my old job back. But Mom got all over me. She said, "Son, why did you leave that good paying job down there, making 65 cents an hour?" I said, "Well, Mom, they're paying better in South Dakota." Well, she said, "Yeah, but that's not sure." And I thought many times, if we had ever come home from the mission field, I mean, she believed in finishing a job. Now, if we had had to come home because of health, and there were times that we were needed back home, and I realize it now, but if there was something, you know, that really we had to come home for, but if we had just decided to give it up or quit and come home, she would have been all over me. I mean, I know she would have, because, and in 1993, she was given the statewide award for the Missionary Member of the Year from the Nebraska Baptist Association or Convention. And she was proud to show us that, and I was proud of her. So, you know, I couldn't have had a more supportive mother. And Dad was, well, whatever you think you ought to do. I mean, whenever we talked to him about that, and I don't know if I probably had a letter once in a while. When we went back to visit him, you know, after we'd been on furlough, he was always proud to introduce us around and let it take me to church to preach and things. But anyhow, so my mom was really a active mission supporter. She made baby quilts for HIV babies in a hospital in Denver. She made thousands of them, I'm sure. She was all the time getting scraps together to make quilts. So, you know, I had a great example there of living for other people and ministering to other people and forgetting about yourself, you know, and trying to just do something that, I mean, she wasn't against going to a movie once in a while or something. In fact, the only time I remember Dad taking her to a movie, it was a month ahead of her birthday. He had got the wrong day. But she enjoyed it, I mean, because he did it. Well, anyhow, back to my siblings. I'll have to say, I've probably gotten to know them better since they were adults, but because my sister was born one night when my mom somehow had disguised her pregnancy. She got pregnant just before Dad went in the Army, I'm sure. And I was 13, but I wasn't very much aware of, I didn't look at girls, but I didn't notice their figure that much, you know. So I was working at the truck, no, this is the summer after I worked at the truck farm, but she called out there. I had two high school friends who were still working there, and they stayed out there through the summer. They had a room fixed down in one of the cellars where they kept the food. Forgot what they called them, but so they invited me out to spend the night with them, and I went out and stayed out there with them. When I got home the next day, I had a new sister. So my sister Joan was born that night that Mom arranged for me to be away from the house, and she was born at the house. I don't know where Bruce was, no telling, and whether he would have been aware of anything, because he was 6 years younger, so he would have been 7 years old. Okay, little baby sister was a doll, and the interesting thing about her, well, I didn't have much to do with her upkeep or anything because I was in the Army before long, as soon as high school graduation. But we lived next to the Catholic parish house. Now, the church was on the corner where I actually cut grass and shoveled snow, at times. But in the parish house where the priest and his older priest mentor lived, and they had two Irish ladies that kept the house. There was an aunt and her niece, and they were pure Irish. I mean, just the lilt in their voice would just make you think of Ireland. But they loved my sister to death. I mean, she spent as much time over there, I think, as she did at home, because they were always coming over to take her over to the house there and entertain her and give her, I don't know what all they gave her to eat, maybe not too much bad stuff. So then I went to Oregon, and I was with her and Bruce there. So by Oregon time, I was like about almost 16, and he was 10. And we had good times together, did some things together, went to church together, and I made a lot of friends in the youth group at our First Baptist Church there. And he was included on things, but he likes to, joke around, and now our contacts are by phone. I see him every 15 or 20 years. We used to, when we were, on the mission field, we would stop off at their place and visit for a day or two, and sometimes coming in, but if we were going back, we'd take stuff that we didn't get around to packing to ship and mail it from their post office. I remember very much, finishing out those boxes and all. And they were wonderful. He and Marcia were a wonderful host and hostess. And he would take me with him. He's a professor at the college. Take me with him to meet his college teachers, and we walked around town a lot and he liked coffee, so we'd go to a fast food place and have coffee together and talk. And sometimes we'd sit out in his garage. And he did smoke a little bit for a while, but he quit that pretty soon. But Marcia would not allow smoking in the house. So he had a place in the garage. And we'd talk politics and church. They were active Methodists. And we were very much on the same wavelength about race or politics or things like that, anti-corruption and so on. But I'm trying to think now. I found out, well, I don't know if he was joking. I don't think he was. Here on a recent phone call, probably a few months back, he said, "Bob, I was hurt with you when you decided to come back to Nebraska." He said, "I wanted you to bring me with you." I said, "You did?" I said, "I didn't know anything about that." Of course, I wasn't thinking about him or her either. I was just talking to my folks to let me go back, which they did. I mean, that's another time when Mom trusted my decision on it. And but he said that he was very unhappy. I guess after Dad had started drinking a little bit, and then he had a lot of good friends out there, and he was on the. They had elementary school football teams and had a conference there in town playing each other, and he was a good ball player, so he had recognition from that even at that young age. And later in high school, let's see how far, if they came back in 48 to stay, so he would have been maybe maybe junior high. I don't know exactly. I haven't figured it out. And he did play there at home. He played on the ball team. But he said when he moved to this little town, he had a real good friend. And they had spent a lot of time together. He was very active in school events and sports. And when Mom was talking about coming back to Nebraska, I don't know who introduced the subject, but his friend's parents said, Bruce, if it works out, if you would like to stay here, we'll be glad for you to stay with us and be part of our family. And of course Mom did not agree to that, and I'm sure Bruce was glad later, but he said that he kind of got angry with her about that because she was just messing up his life, all the way around. But I think after he got back to Chadron, I'm sure he made friends there too. But he did have some problems with his stepdad. George was a sweet old-fashioned guy that would do anything for you. And I know in the cold winter months he would go around to the elderly people and help massage their legs and all those kind of things to help make them more comfortable. He was a diamond in the rough, the way I called him. But he didn't like the way that Bruce, I think, was being a little kind of ugly to his mom, maybe, or disrespectful, or I'm sure maybe he wasn't happy that she remarried. I was not there, so I can't tell you. But so the day, well, I got two versions on the day he joined the Air Force. First one I heard was that he had joined the Air Force. I think the recruiters were down at the hotel. And he came home and he said, well, y'all aren't going to get to boss me around anymore. I'm not going to let anybody boss me around. I joined the Air Force. Well, you know how funny that was. But later, it seemed like on the phone, he told me that they had been there a couple of times, but they had missed connection, the recruiters had. And said the day that they were there on that particular day, Mom went to see him to be sure that they were still there when Bruce came down to sign up. So I don't know for sure. Maybe she felt like he needed to grow up, and this was the best way. So anyhow, he did join the Air Force and had a good career. He got to boss the generals around, these pilots, hot shot pilots, because he operated one of the, what they call those trainers, or ones that imitated a cockpit. Simulator, yeah. He said, boy, when you're in charge of that, it doesn't matter what rank they are. If they're not doing it right, you tell them and you get by with it. And his visits to Uliton, now before he got out of the service, he was stationed in Florida. And when we had our church here in Anniston at Uliton Baptist Church, he came up on weekends 2 or 3 times to spend time with us. And when the first time he came, he was a big, chesty, brawn kid. Well, he came back a few months later, and he was all slimmed down. And he said that he and some of his buddies had gone on a coffee and cigarette diet. So I don't think he's smoked in quite a while, and I mentioned a while ago some, but I think it was very seldom, if any, but he still loved his coffee. And he was always slender, skinny maybe. you could say, all. And he had open heart surgery about 6 years ago. So he's been really, but his wife she's a retired school principal teacher and very businesslike and very able person, and she's taking good care of him, be sure his medication, and he gets to the doctor when he needs to. And of course, he jokes about her controlling him, and bossing him around and all that. But he loves her to death, and he met her in college after, well, a little bit more of that first story. He stayed with us a few times, and when he got out of the service, he came and stayed with us several weeks. Now, this would have been probably the summer of 66, I guess. Of 56, I mean. So you weren't on the picture yet, but yeah, I didn't know if he was ever going to leave, and I wasn't sure how to push him out of the house, because that parsonage wasn't very big. I think he was sleeping must have been in a closet or a storage room somewhere in the back there, and he wasn't too much on hygiene. He wasn't too great on taking a bath every day or something. I don't know, but he loved the people out there, and we had one family. The fellow was a pipe shop worker, had 2 lovely daughters, and his wife was a wonderful cook. And she had a tradition of inviting a whole bunch of people in on her birthday to celebrate her birthday, and she cooked the meal. And we got to go to one of those, and I bet you Bruce has mentioned that every other phone call. How wonderful that family treated him, and how wonderful that food was. And just a very plain house, and it was full of people that day. And I think we probably ate there another time or two. They were just wonderful friends. So, and the next door neighbor they had a son just about his age, and they buddied up and did things together. And then the Lloyds had the young people come and have recreation in their basement on Sunday night after church, and he went with us on that, played ping pong and stuff. And so he was pretty well settled in, at Hewletton, but I guess it was getting on toward the opening of the college semester, and he did get his college work and his teacher's degree and everything there at Shadron. He said, Bob, he said, you were not much of a help to me in school. He said when I got back and started high school, he said we had a lady principal, and she said, whoa, Stewart, are you related to Bob Stewart? And he said, yeah, he's my big brother. And she said, well, I know you're going to be a real outstanding, top-notch student. He said, I didn't like that kind of invitation, but he did. And he, how did that work out? He didn't finish high school before he joined the service. He was slacking just a little bit. He didn't take his tests, and I don't know what all. He was, ready to leave. And so when he was in college, there at Shadron State, they had at that time they had a high school where they could teach, practice teach. I think that it's been closed down a long time, but I'm sure they still have connections where they go to schools there. But that's where he did his practice teaching, and he said Mr. Myers, who was one of my favorite teachers, math teacher, but later was principal at the high school, and he was principal when Bob was studying at the college.
Bruce.
And Bruce, yeah, he was over there, and Mr. Myers looked him up, and he said, Bruce, somebody told me Mr. Myers wants to talk to you, and he thought, what have I done now? But when he met with Mr. Myers in that little room, Mr. Myers had his GED diploma. Or, no, it was a regular high school diploma. He said, Bruce, you left us early, but you've earned it, And Bruce said that was a very proud day for him, you know. And he, as soon as he finished college, he was a principal right off. I don't think he ever taught high school. Well, he did when he was principal some, but one day he told me quite a bit about his first day, this little school down there right close to the Colorado line. Yeah. They didn't know him, but they had a good recommendation, and he had a good experience. He said it was strange at first, you know, I had to get used to small town that people, but he had a good personality. I mean, he would talk himself down, but he was a brilliant guy, especially in math. He told me things that I never heard of before about the internet that was coming in the future. Okay, well, I talked to them both on the phone recently, and they're both doing pretty well. My sister has Parkinson's. She's in assisted living. Bruce and Marcia moved to Arizona in the winter time to get out away from the snow in Nebraska, but they're doing fine, so I'm proud of them. I enjoy having a family name, Bob. My son has it. I hope he enjoys it, and I have do I have a grandson?
Mm-hmm.
Bob?
Bodie.
Bodie, yeah. When I think about it, I know that's Robert, what's his middle name?
Robert Donald.
Robert, yeah, named after both granddads, right? So my dad was Bob, and his dad was Bob, and I got the impression that I had several more, but I'm not positive about that. But anyhow, my dad grew up in a little town called Petersburg, Nebraska. Was about 100 miles west of Omaha, and he was a traveling magazine salesman when my folks met. So he met my wife there in our hometown, I think at a dance somewhere.
Your mom.
My mom, yeah, my mom, my mother. And I don't know how long they dated. She was 19 when they got married. So I know she was born in 1911 because I was born in 1928. And she was 19 or maybe 20 by the time I was born. Okay. So I know Dad graduated from high school. I know my grandmother thought he was a smart man, as I've said. I know he loved playing the clarinet in the band. We have pictures of it, and I've heard him tell about it. And he just encouraged me every way he could to try to learn to play the clarinet, and he had this clarinet for me to use. And I tried to learn. I had a teacher in our high school music teacher, and I never learned how to keep the reed from squeaking. So I couldn't advance, you know, because of that. So, but I did learn to play a tie instrument later. I learned to play the very difficult tie cymbals.
Let's get on to your grandpa.
Yeah, and my grandpa,
my
grandpa was a mail carrier. I know that much about him. When I was 5 years old, my dad took me on the train, went right through Petersburg, and we went down and visited him for about a week. Granddad, I kind of remember him. He was a tall, strong man with a big, big mustache. And he was always kind to me, the best I remember. Now, my grandmother was a sweetie. And I never got back down there until we drove through there. Mom and I did after we were up in Chadron one time. I didn't recognize anything or anybody in the town. Main thing I remember, they would let me go to town every day, which was a few blocks, and they gave me a nickel, and I bought some Nabisco little creamy cookies, and I had those every day while I was there. I met my little cousin, who was much younger, and a few other of my relatives. And we ran into them when we went to San Francisco to get on the ship. And we ran into my aunt when we came home on the ship in '68. Spent some time with her in Napa, California. So we had a few contacts in later life, but don't remember them ever coming up to Shadron. If they did, I wasn't old enough to know about it. So, but they're good folks. I know that they were active in church, and my uncle was pretty active in local politics. Well, my dad ran and was a councilman in our part of town one year. So that's all I can say.